kids that like.
There you go. Well, what is hitting the wall? It's a fuel crisis. It's your body running out of carbohydrate sources for fuel. And you know, we tend to focus on the muscle and when we look at fatigue, but it's really a fuel crisis in your brain. Your brain, when you're eating carbohydrates, is reliant on glucose, and when you're out of glucose and you're at 20 miles or wherever, your brain is starving and it shuts down, and you have these intrusive thoughts of carbohydrate, and you know, you curl up in the fetal position, or you're running with whatever energy you have to a Dunkin' Donuts to fill that need for glucose in the brain. But you know, what's the irony here? The irony is when you hit the wall, you actually have tens of thousands of calories on board by way of your fat stores. You just can't access them. So which fuel tank do you want access to? Your glycogen tank? You've always got access to that, but it's limiting. How do you get access to your fat fuel tank? Because it's a physiologic truth that even though your glycogen's gone, if you haven't adapted to a low-carb diet, you still cannot access that fat fuel to perform exercise. So let's look a little bit closer at how we access fat for fuel. And this is by no means a simple process, and I always hesitate to oversimplify processes because many factors contribute to lipolysis and fat breakdown. But I'm always amazed at this graph because clearly there is a dominant regulator here, and that regulator is insulin. And this is a graph of insulin versus fat breakdown or lipolysis. And these types of you know, elegant experiments have been done repeatedly, and you will see that that relationship is not a straight line. It's a curvilinear or exponential relationship, such that at sort of the break point there, you see just small changes in insulin can result in dramatic changes in fat breakdown. And that's well within the physiologic range of insulin. That's, you know, that's the difference between going out and exercising in a fasted state, or where you've drinking water, versus consuming Gatorade or consuming a bagel before exercise. That would easily move your insulin levels up, you know, 10, 20, 30 picomole. And that has, you know, again, a very profound effect on your fat mobilization. And it's not just fat breakdown. The same type of graph exists for fat oxidation, fat burning in muscle. So insulin is a dominant hormone controlling lipid metabolism, and there are other hormones as well playing a role, but clearly insulin's the one that's putting the brakes on mobilizing and oxidizing fat. So the whole logic of sports drinks and consuming carbohydrates before exercise is that it actually promotes carbohydrate oxidation, but it inhibits fat oxidation. So if that's your goal, that's the last thing you want to do. And this is a bit redundant for this audience. You know, why should we be concerned about the sports drinks that are sugar-based? Well, they spike your blood sugar, and that often leads to a rebound hypoglycemia and low blood sugar. And this is not just for, you know, sedentary folks here. We all are familiar with this sort of roller coaster spike crash phenomenon, but this is also a concern for athletes if you consume a pre-exercise sugar-based drink. And the problem is, you know, low blood sugar is not tolerated well. It causes fatigue, and it's legitimately a stress response, and it's related to hunger. The sugar spike itself is obviously followed by an insulin spike, which, among other things, shuts down your fat breakdown and oxidation. But a lot of these sports drinks, because they're simple sugars, have a high osmolality, so they're hypertonic. And a lot of endurance athletes in particular that are taking these, you know, gels and drinks by the truckloads are having a lot of GI distress because of the osmolality of the solution, and that's something that is related to stomach distress and GI distress. So this is sort of the downside of sugar-based sports drink. Because of the osmolality, they decrease, they slow rather gastric emptying, and are associated in many people, many athletes, with gastric distress. And that's why Gatorade can only put so much sugar in their solutions, because they are aware of keeping their product hypotonic. So it has less particles in solution than the blood. But that means people have to redose with the Gatorade frequently during exercise. And of course, as I've mentioned, blocks fat breakdown. So I like to use this car analogy as to what might be a better situation if you do want to use sports drink. And I like fast cars, and I think it's an appropriate analogy. But you think about your gas tank, and if you want optimal performance out of your car, you don't want to empty your entire gas tank into your engine at one time. It'll flood. So you have fuel injectors that spray a little bit of gas every time your piston goes up and down, and you get nice, good fuel mileage and performance out of your car. Well, think of the same thing with your intestines. If you consume carbohydrate, you don't want all that glucose to be dumped into your bloodstream at once. That's overkill. What you really want is a slow release form of a carbohydrate, if you're going to consume carbohydrate at all, that is released in a sort of time-released manner out of the intestines, that provides a steady fuel for muscle, and that would theoretically be associated with better performance. Not to mention, it would not stimulate insulin to the same level, and potentially then not inhibit fat breakdown and oxidation to the same extent. So what would a more ideal sports drink look like? And truthfully, almost all the sports drinks out there are fast acting. They're intended to be absorbed quickly, to provide fast energy. Again, I would argue for those reasons that you really want one that's absorbed slowly, that doesn't stimulate insulin, so it doesn't block your fat breakdown and oxidation. And of course, based on those two, you might think, well, fiber, that's released slowly, but fiber doesn't actually get absorbed, right? It doesn't provide fuel, energy. So the third point there is you would want it to actually provide 4 kcals per gram like other carbohydrates and be fully absorbed. So here's the fascinating story that I'll just take 5 or 10 minutes to just describe to you. GSD stands for glycogen storage disease, and this is a very rare but very serious genetic disease that afflicts about 1 in 25,000 kids. So it's rare, and it doesn't get a lot of attention because it's rare as far as research and funding and so forth. But this particular form of glycogen storage disease, 1A, is due to a single gene defect in the liver. The gene there is, or the actual enzyme that is defective, is glucose 6-phosphatase, and this is an enzyme that's responsible for converting glycogen to glucose.